Good afternoon, everyone. Um, Today, I'm going to talk about a sector which is slightly problematic. And the reason why it's problematic is because in most of Calcutta Research Group's work, we try to foreground what is known as the frontier people, not just in terms of geography, but also in terms of power configuration. So today, I will talk about the peripheral among the frontier. I mean, you will understand that in terms of citizenship, questions of number don't really matter because, women are today almost 48 point some percent of the population. But yet, even when we homogenize women and talk about them as a group, we discuss women as if they are a minority. And probably they share a lot of characteristics with the minorities because of sheer power configuration. And when we are asked to talk about women, we, me included, we inevitably talk about the middle class women because they are part of the discourse. The feminist movement that have included women's experiences within a city often also talks about the middle class women. Hardly ever movements talk about the peripheral among these women. And if I start talking about the peripheral among women's groups, it will be like peeling an onion because most women share, even in the spectrum of vulnerability, most women share some vulnerability or the other, so that probably all, if you define them in different ways, it depends on your location, it depends on your gaze. From your perspective, you will see that whether we are talking about sexual minorities, whether we are talking about lower class, whether we are talking about the lowest among the caste spectrum, whether we are talking about religion, if you sort of divide the population, the female population of any city, then you will see that inevitably almost everybody within that population will appear to be a minority. Now, the interesting thing is, if you go through most census data, you will see that the number of female population in the cities is usually less than the men. And this is a historical, truth. So in terms of indexes. This is something that we have to remember. Now, you might say, but Paula, the Delhi might have more. I don't know what the statistics are of Delhi. Might have more in numbers of population than the other places in, well, other parts of the country. But inevitably, what we have seen is that cities have less women. And this was true for most of Kolkata. Now, I am supposed to talk about the pandemic and women's population in the city of Kolkata around the pandemic. So, what I decided was it is not possible, in 40 minutes' time to talk about women's population within the city in Kolkata during pandemic, the whole of this group of women. Okay. So I will talk about a small section of that. I will talk about who are clearly the peripheral within that group, and that is the migrant women. not the migrant women migrating from West Bengal. Today, the statistics that we have of people migrating from West Bengal is about 23 to 24 lakhs. This is the statistics. Statistics is always guess estimates because you have people from the organized sector and people from the unorganized sector. And the unorganized sector is a sector which is very difficult to address because you really don't know the numbers. So I will talk about the unorganized sector here today in terms of Kolkata. Now, the three groups that I'm going to talk about are sex workers, domestic workers, and care workers within the city. Why am I zeroing these populations? Because whether you look at, sex workers, domestic workers, or care workers, the larger number within the city are women who have migrated into the city. Now, in the last census, the number that was given to us in terms of migrant people into the city of Kolkata was 8.3 lakhs. And there were more women than men. Interestingly, there's another statistics that has created quite a bit of debate, and that is there were more people coming from outside the state itself into Kolkata than from the different districts. Among the districts, one of the highest in terms of jobs among the sex workers and the domestic care workers are people coming from Midnapur. I am not, I'm not trying to explain or discuss these numbers, but we have to begin somewhere. So I'm just throwing some numbers at you. These numbers are in the public domain. So this is not a number that I have arrived at through my research because I am not a person who does research on numbers. I'm not a number cruncher. I'm a person who tries to understand the phenomena through the numbers that are given to me. And these numbers are in the public domain. So, among migrant women, there are over a lakh today. At one time, they were a majority who came to Kolkata for marriage. And these women were largely from the districts. The women who came for work are women who are from out of state. Now, there's a huge discourse on this because there's a debate. The idea, the established idea is that Bengal doesn't have enough jobs for people. Now, so what explains this more people migrating into Bengal, the leading city of Bengal, from different states than from districts? One of the things that people say is that and that explains why there are so many more women in the group, and that is because a lot of women come for blue collar jobs. So there is there's a plethora of blue collar jobs, but in terms of white collar jobs, that is less in number. Be that as it may, we will talk about the three sections of the city: care workers, domestic workers, and sex workers. Now, a lot of these people, these women who have come to the city for these work interchanged during COVID. And that is also a marker of their resilience within the city or their effort to survive. in the manufacturing segment, in the construction segment, there were more people who were trying to leave the city during COVID. But the sex workers somehow remained in the city. Now, if we look at some of the statistics, it is said that there were about 60,000 sex workers in the city. All are guess estimates. It's very difficult because, for example, today, among the numbers that we can gather in Shonagachi, for example, now sex work is not concentrated only in one place. Often we think that among the sex workers, mostly all these people are living in Shonagachi. That is not true. The highest number of sex workers are in the area called Bobajar. About 15,000 to 17,000 female sex workers live in Bobajar now. Again, these are majority female population, but not exclusively female population. In any of these three spheres, whether it's sex work, whether it's domestic work or care work, people are not exclusively women. They are largely women, but not exclusively women. Sex workers. Now, the history, I will give a little bit of history thrown in to this discussion because it's important to be mindful of the history. We will understand the phenomena better if we understand the history. So the history of sex work in Kolkata is very, very interesting. We have recently concluded a large study on that. Me and two of my students who are now uh, independent researchers and university teachers, we have done this work on female sex workers in Kolkata. And the paper that we wrote is entitled Bar Bonita to Sex Worker. So, so that history shows that the presence of female sex workers in the city is not happenstance. These women during the colonial period were actually encouraged to settle in the center of the city. And this, um, intensely sort of populated areas of Bobajar and Shonagachi also happened because the city planning was done in such a way that these sex workers concentrated in these areas. But Kolkata is one of those cities which has never been sanitized. In many cities of the world, especially from the global north, that again, there's a lot of discourse between global north and global south, and I argue that this is not a homogeneous concept. These ghettos of sex workers, these places where they live, they can be considered that they are the south of the south. But there are rich areas which can be considered islands of north within the city. So, these are very, complex phenomena. These sex workers are settled in Shonagachi or Bubajar because it is because of the urban developers. Now, the thing is, solicitation and all these processes make sex work a very complicated profession, but we also know that there have never been a city, or there's no city on earth that does not have sex workers in them. There are no cities on earth. Every city, one of the features of a city is a district, an area where you have the presence of sex workers. The next thing is there are no city on earth where you do not have domestic workers. Every city has domestic workers. And thirdly, there are no cities on earth where you don't have care workers. You might not have women workers in other segments available in the city, but these three segments are there in large numbers. So obviously, during COVID, sex workers had a tremendously problematic time. There were newspaper articles which gave the number of sex workers in the state to be 5 lakhs. And over, so 1/10, or at least, maybe slightly more than that number of sex workers in the city were, in Kolkata, and largely women sex workers and sex workers who belong to the LGBTQ community. They had the most problematic of times within the city. And, you know, organizations such as Durbar that represented the sex workers constantly kept saying that we are not opposing the lockdowns, but something needs to be done. Because unlike in the manufacture sector, unlike in the building sector, these women cannot leave the cities. Interestingly, then, therefore, the question is, these people to leave the city, to be able to get out of the city, you needed resources to get out. These are the most impoverished people in the city. So that is why it was very, very difficult to move out of the city. So the most problematic of the situations for the sex workers were, in these areas because they just could not leave the city. And they also had a problem about going back. Many of them had left their homes for good. And so to go back, where would they go back? So return is actually another turn for them. There is no returning. Now, if we look at the domestic workers in the city, it is said that about 2.5 lakh women are domestic workers in the city. And many of these domestic workers I have interviewed, these domestic workers were just representative of this number. I have not been able to talk to all women, but many of them are, this is a segment where a lot of these people are from the districts. So in terms of care work and sex work, we see more people from out of state, but among the domestic workers, what was that there are more people from the districts. Domestic work is a phenomena which is particularly problematic for people during lockdown. Why? Because many of these women lived in that particular area where they are doing their work. So domestic work is not like manufacturing work. So it's not as if their living quarters are different from where they're working. Most domestic workers in the city, and one also has to understand that space in the city is always contested. So many of these women, young women who live in the city, as we say, Kajir Mashi, they are known as, we use familial terms with them, but they're never really Mashi. They're always workers. For example, you never, never, ever share utensils with them. You try not to use the same washrooms with them. You never exchange clothes with them. There is always an hierarchy with them. Yet, the other day I was talking about domestic workers. Somebody said, in terms of food, in terms of, dress, in terms of sharing familiar objects of life, you have an hierarchy with domestic workers. You do not ever, ever share these things with them. And yet, sometimes domestic workers are probably the closest that you have. We do not talk to our family members as we talk to our domestic workers. So you see, this is a very complex relationship. But the hierarchy is clearly shown in the case of the pandemic because during the pandemic, most of the domestic workers were asked to leave. So the first people, so here is a clear, symbol that these people are outsiders. Because we all know pandemic, after all, never grows out of our homes. We always say the pandemic is from outside. Take it from me, people in Wuhan have also said that the pandemic came to them from outside. No city ever acknowledges the fact that anything that is problematic, whether it's COVID-19, whether it's HIV, all these public health challenges are considered as something that has come from outside. And lo and behold, God forbid, if there's anybody blamed for any disease that has come to your home, it is the domestic workers for COVID-19. Inevitably, I have seen householders saying, we were perfectly okay, our domestic worker brought in this disease. And then there is this moralistic judgment about the domestic worker. You never, ever are concerned about their health. You're hardly ever, I shouldn't say never ever, but you're hardly ever. So the first thing that happened during lockdown is to clearly tell these people at home that you have to live. How many of us had domestic workers living with us during lockdown? Because that is where the borders are. You see, we talk about borders and boundaries, but in terms of citizenship, the borders are in our homes. So you see, whether it's a sex worker or a domestic worker, we have seen that this bordering of vulnerability or vulnerable population, firstly, you blame the vulnerable population, then you create a border with them. After all, migrant workers were sprayed with insecticide in the actual border areas between states. And we are not talking of international borders, we are talking of internal borders. So even bordering is now in concentric circle. And the most intimate section of bordering is in your home. So there, the division is between you and your domestic worker. Over 75%, in fact, 78% of these domestic workers are women. And largely it is the women who are supposed to be under your protection as a citizen of the country, as a member of the city, who are staying in your homes. And the first action we take is to throw them out during COVID. Many of these women, particularly young women, became so impoverished that they joined the ranks of the most impoverished of the sex workers. Now, Shonagachi area is known for one thing, and that is the ability of this area to stem HIV. But COVID-19 could not be stemmed because there were all these migrant domestic workers who were pushed into such a harrowing situation that they had to join the ranks of the most impoverished of the sex workers. Now, in terms of care workers also are into different camps. One should never homogenize any work, and particularly care work, especially when one is talking about the experience of the pandemic. Because in the pandemic, we have seen that the most essential, the so-called essential workers were care workers and other workers who were into services, which were very essential, people who worked in crematorium, all of this, supplies of food. And we decided we got a thriving at that time platform economy as a result of COVID-19. But women could not enter that economy. That economy, the platform jobs were largely occupied by the more, people who had better work condition or the men. The women went slid into into greater impoverishment as a result of COVID-19. And in care work, you had a group that was sought after. That does not make them empowered because they were in closest contact with the disease. So please don't think that just because their jobs lasted, that they were in better position. No, in most of these, hospitals that we have seen where women care workers, women nurses stayed, their numbers were depleted because of the first first group of people, care workers, who themselves fell ill. So these women had to work double shift regularly. And however, at least these women could get their salaries. If we talk about the ASHA workers were handling more than triple the number of people that they handled, at times 10 times more ASHA workers. And these ASHA workers were the most impoverished. They were not, at least the women in the hospitals were given PPE kits, not because people took care of them, but because they were in closest contact with these people. So the more affluent class who could go to the hospital, who could still get a hospital bed, who could still access, oxygen, made sure that their care workers were more kitted. But the ASHA workers, forget about PPE. They got gloves, 2 pairs of gloves for one entire month, sometimes not even that. And they went from home to home, but they were looked upon with enormous amount of suspicion, enormous amount of, disrespect. And yet they had to, because people did not stop being, women did not stop being pregnant. Women did not stop having children. In fact, more people got pregnant at that time. And these ASHA workers were people who serviced most of the poorer class of the population. So, what I am trying to say is all of these women, whether we talk about sex workers, whether we talk about domestic workers, whether we talk about care workers, they're all migrant citizens. I'm using the word migrant citizen because most of them migrated into the city, whether from districts or from villages or from other states. However, this is not to say that none of them were from the city. Many of them are from the city, are into these professions, but they are the more impoverished segments of the population. And these work that women did were the most endangered of the work during the pandemic. So, often we look upon pandemic as the most, importantly, as the greatest leveler. We say that the pandemic treated pauper and the prince equally. In terms of the disease, both contracted it, but the more impoverished you are, the more at risk you were. So, so women from sex work, women from, domestic work, and women, in the lower ranks of the care work were the women who were most impoverished during this work. And interestingly, care workers, again, the other thing that we have to understand is that care workers were progressively being treated as sex workers because all of these women worked with their body during pandemic within the city. Their bodies were considered as markers of not impoverishment, but as markers of that force that was bringing the disease into the city. They were the people who were handling the disease because many of these sex workers had to go and take up jobs who who dealt with the medical waste, because care workers who were not as impoverished would not deal with the medical waste. So if you look at a at a or try to make an analysis of workers who were handling medical waste, you will see that many of the sex workers who were not getting jobs had to go into that sector. I have spoken to, sex workers who at one time told me, why will I not do sex work? That helps me from being impoverished. Because if I don't do sex work, I will have to be a rag picker. So, a rag pickers, well, in our hierarchy, a rag picker is below the poverty line because they address that kind of intimate waste. So care workers slid down sometimes, if they could not do this double shifts, into informal workers. Informal domestic workers slid to the level of sex workers, and sex workers became people who had to address medical waste. So, we talk about citizenship. We talk about discursively that a disease like COVID-19 actually made the world an equal playing field, but at the end of the day, it did not. At the end of the day, what we have noticed is that the most impoverished of the group of people within the city of Kolkata, because mind you, the number of sex workers, the number of domestic workers, or the number of care workers, whether you like it or not, the most number of these workers within the city are people who migrated into the city. And also, they are much more in number than any other part of the state. So, we have to understand that it was not just pandemic. Now, here I will pick up the last aspects of what I'm trying to talk about today, and that is the pandemic was not a standalone thing. Because remember, we had cyclones also at that point of time, and this is a common phenomena. In case of cyclones, the areas where we had cyclones, again, women's situation was much more worsened than that of, the other groups of population. And the most endangered were women who had, newborn children. Because when camps are there, when so-called social distancing, that's a bad word in the context of India, because historically we have seen social distancing. It's nothing new. And the distancings that I'm talking about, we are a very hierarchical society. So women are always distanced from everything, not just power circles, but also intimate circles also. Women do not have the power, are not empowered enough to decide even the place of stay that they will select. So, in terms of that sort of a situation during cyclones, the most endangered were group of women who were actually in the camps with newborn children. And if we look at people, the migrants who tried to go back to their areas, the most endangered were teenage girls, because particularly menstruating girls. And And when we talk about women's situation in all of these sectors, we have women largely working, women who are within the menstruating age. So that brings in another, factor of problem for these women. But these women did not commit suicide. Women did not let it go. At the end of my lecture, I have to talk about women's resilience. Even women who were walking miles and miles back, even those who died on the way, died because they wanted to live. So it was not women's defeat to the nature. It was not because it was not just a natural disaster. Natural disaster was compounded by the social hierarchies that we have. And that is the important factor. We contribute to natural disasters. We call it natural, but it is often very unnatural because what we consider as climate change is a product of environmental degradation. What is considered as environmental degradation is often, if not man-made, then man-influenced or people-influenced. And the most impoverished within the scale are the most who are in danger. Whether we talk about climate change, whether we talk about climatic disasters, episodes of disasters, pandemics, the most vulnerable of the population are people who are having least power. And among the least power are the migrant workers, and among these migrant workers are the female migrant workers. But at the end of the day, 700, 1,000, 1,500 die, but we are talking about millions, and these millions survive. Not because the state has helped them, not because private individuals help them, but because they are resilient. They have their effort, their movement, and their struggle to survive keep them alive. So the fact that they are alive is an achievement unto itself. And that shows the resilience of the city, that shows the resilience of the women within the city. This is a very short lecture. I know I've thrown in a number of things with very crazy statistics, but I think I should stop here. That would give us about 15 to 20 minutes to discuss.